I'm going to show you the game between Bobby Fischer and Mark Taimanov from the Interzonal tournament in 1970. Remember, it's free to subscribe to the channel. Just click on the button below, and if you'd like to support the channel, then do check out the links to PayPal and patreon.com in the video description. So this game, Fischer-Taimanov, was played at the end of the Interzonal tournament when Fischer had this extraordinary run of 7 victories in a row to secure victory in the tournament. So his opponent here, Mark Taimanov, one of the great Soviet chess players in the post-war era. Taimanov was a remarkable person. He died in 2016 at the age of 90. And what a life he'd had. Surviving the siege of Leningrad in the Second World War, and not only was he a superb chess player, he was the Soviet champion, represented the Soviet Union on many occasions, but he was also one of the greatest concert pianists of the 20th century. I mean, really, quite extraordinary. I once heard him play the piano at the end of a tournament. It's fantastic, with accompanying Vasily Smyslov singing. That was a wonderful moment. So I should probably just backtrack a couple of moves. This position, Taimanov is playing his opening. This is the Taimanov system of the Sicilian. He was a great theoretical expert as well. And of course you can play knight c3 here, but Fischer goes for knight b5, and in a way I think this suits his style very well. He liked control, and he's established this Marozzi bind. A little bit different because White's knights are not on the traditional squares here of d4 and c3, but you can see the structure is a typical hedgehog structure with the pawns here on d6 and e6, and White has the pawns on c4 and e4. So the knight comes out to a3. Normally we see the knight on d4 in this kind of setup, and very often Black's knight is on d7. So the difference is with the knights here, with a knight on a3, it does mean at least White is securely preventing this break with b5. Of course, this is one of Black's big strategic aims in the hedgehog. And Taimanov plays it quite a solid system here with Black. Traditionally, one would put the bishop on b7 here to get some pressure on e4. Perhaps moving that knight to e5 later. But bishop d7, well, we'll see what Taimanov's idea is. He actually still wants to play for the b5 pawn break here. And this looks very involved, but here's the plan. We'll get there in a second. Really, Black needs sort of 5 rooks in this position. One to go to e8, one c8, one here, one here. You can be very flexible, but okay, here's Taimanov's idea. So he's tucking the bishop back on e8, and so the rook has some potential activity on the d file. But that means the d7 square is available, sometimes for the knight to come here. And here the other rook goes to b7. Of course, it's protecting the pawn on b6. But it wants to support this break with b5. But Fischer clamps that with a4. And here is a really important moment in the game where Black has to decide on a strategy. And I suppose you could say that Black's pieces, well, the bishop here and rook here, aren't really set up to support, say, a break with d5. But Black could wait, maybe knight d7 here, and perhaps bishop f6. But Taimanov goes for a very different strategy, a5. So just controlling or giving more control over the b4 square, and that means that white is unable to push with b4, and that means that black has greater control over c5. The downside of this is that it rules out this break with b5 forever. But Taimanov is envisaging a dark square control in this position, as we'll see. Excuse me. So knight d4 from Fischer. But I think Fischer would like this position with white because he has control, he has space, and he has control. Kind of, well, if you think of other openings that Fischer liked, for example, the white side of the Spanish, where he often got a space advantage with white. Okay, different kind of structure, but he liked control. In which, in these kind of positions, then he could employ, kind of piece manoeuvres that very much suited his style when there's a fixed pawn structure. So now we see Taimanov's plan. He's playing his bishop to f6. Of course, one could duck out of this challenge. That's possible, actually, but Fischer exchanged, and he's still got his nice space advantage. But we can see Taimanov's idea that he's established his pawns on dark squares, having exchanged off that dark squared bishop. I mean, I would take white every time here, but this is absolutely playable for black. It's a little bit passive because black doesn't have a pawn break, basically. But that knight has established itself on c5, and that bishop can come out to c6 to cover both b5 and d5. So Fischer starts to play actively f4. And that does give black actually something to do. And here I think black's best strategy is to play the bishop to c6 and the rook to e7 to at least get a little bit of pressure on the e4 pawn. I still prefer white with a space advantage, but black's position, it's a little bit cramped, but actually I think completely playable. That knight is very fine on c5. And we can see Fischer's manoeuvre here. Over the last couple of moves we've had the rook coming to d2, which allowed the bishop to drop back to d1, and basically it's looking to establish itself on c2, where it'll cover the a4 pawn, covers b3, that's important, but also looks in this direction as well towards black's king side. So nice manoeuvring from Fischer. Now we have knight e6 from Taimanov, and I think this is the first moment, as I said, I think bishop c6 was a better move, just to leave the knight on c5, and I think this is the first moment where it feels to me as though black is going a little bit astray. Well, clearly Taimanov wanted to activate his queen, which is certainly not a bad idea. But still, I think the other way would have been better. So now Fischer starts to activate. So with this rook coming to the third rank and can potentially switch across the board. It's hard to live with this knight on d5, and Taimanov now exchanges. And rook takes. Yeah, I think the problem with... here I would quite like to open up that diagonal for the bishop, but actually black very quickly could seize control of the e-file, and there's potential counterplay there with the knight coming in. So this pushed black's queen back, and now Fischer reacted very quickly. He pushed with e5 to open up the position. Yeah, there is a danger here that black could play, for example, f6 potentially, and put the knight on e5. Got to be careful doing that. There isn't some kind of pawn sacrifice to open up the diagonal, but I mean that's one option. But yeah, basically, if white doesn't force through e5 over the next few moves, then it could be that black will be able to stop white playing e5 and get some kind of control here. So e5 opens up the position, and this is where Fischer starts to really take control. This diagonal opens. Black has to exchange. Now obviously queen takes queen will be met by rook takes rook, and mate next move. Remember that bishop controls the h7 square. And here again, I think Taimanov starts to go a little bit wrong. I mean, I like white's position now. I think knight e6 had to be played to bring that knight back towards the queen side. Now, it does leave the king side a little bit exposed, but I think that's really where the knight belongs. So watch what happens in the game. Rook here. And I think Fischer's next move is excellent. Bishop f5. Perhaps this move was overlooked. Fischer was brilliant at playing with the bishop against the knight, in particular when he could combine it with major pieces here. Well, here basically the rooks. So that bishop stops the knight from getting back towards the queen side. And this is an important move. Here, instead of playing the bishop back, he throws in h4, and that puts black's knight into a poor position. So if pawn takes bishop, then simply pawn takes knight, and white is winning a pawn. Still a lot of work to do in that position, but okay, a clear pawn up. Only white has winning chances there. We'll take the pawn on g5. So let's come back. h4 has just been played. So the knight went back to h7, and now the bishop returned to f3. And I think this highlights the difference between the bishop and knight in this position. The bishop still controls squares on the king side, but also looks right across the other side of the board. And basically, black's knight can only operate in one sector in this position. It takes some time for black's knight to head over to the queen side. In the meantime, white has the initiative. Now my computer thinks that rook c7, after rook c7, black is still defending this position, but I think it's not easy. That pawn break e5 gave white a 3-2 queenside majority, and if Fischer can create a passed pawn, then supported by the bishop, this is going to be difficult. So in practical terms, I think Fischer is doing very well here. Rook d7 played, rook b5, and this starts, well, there's a couple of things. Obviously the pawn break c5 is a potential threat, but also rook b3 as well, adding to the pressure. And Taimanov went on a wild goose chase with the rook, but I'm afraid this didn't help. Let's see what happened. Fischer gave up the h-pawn, and black's rook switched back to the queen side to defend. Threat is rook takes pawn. So Taimanov took. So Fischer is a pawn down here. But now the difference between bishop and knight is even more distinct here. Because now that white has this passed pawn and the bishop controls the queening square, and that knight just hasn't got a foothold. Very difficult for it to switch over to the queen side successfully. And this is a nice move. The rook is just coming behind that passed pawn. If the pawn had pushed straight away, then of course the rook would check. And the rook comes behind the pawn with chances to defend, but it's very different playing the rook back first. And then that is very hard to stop. So let's see how the game concluded. You notice that the kingside pawns completely irrelevant. These ones are going nowhere. Threatening pawn to a7, so the rook has to block. And now it is time for white's king to sprint over. So it's heading towards that rook on a7. Here we go. Pawn threatened, so the bishop covers, and again this is the plan. Well, that stops the king coming over for the moment, and threatens knight c5. So the rook comes up to prevent knight c5, but the king makes its way anyway. And a check. And here the final move of the game was king b5. In some sources it's given king takes pawn. That did not occur because knight d8 would actually should draw the game, threatening the bishop. But king b5 is absolutely decisive. I can't imagine Fischer messing up like that. Here the big difference is, of course, if the knight goes back to d8, we give a check. Well, king b8 would allow a checkmate. That's quite cute. And if king here, then king b6 is absolutely decisive. The king manages to reach its destination of b6. So after king b5, well, this is just lost. The rook can go back and then check here, and again the king will come to b6. Now when I see that game, I think that is very typical of Fischer's style. I showed you in a previous video this absolute massacre of Rubenetti in the Sicilian, but this is, to me, more typical, this game against Taimanov. Control, very important. Using his space advantage very well. Also, the advantage of bishop over knight. We saw that in this endgame very well, which Fischer exploited on so many occasions. Rook and bishop against rook and knight. And he did so against one of the strongest players in the world, Mark Taimanov. Of course, they were to meet in the first candidates match, the quarterfinal of the candidates. And, well, I'm sure you know what happened there, but we'll take a look at some of those games anyway in future videos. Thanks very much for watching, and remember, check out the Fischer playlist and the Spassky playlist as well for more games of this period. Thanks for watching.